Dr. Pascal Lottaz, welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you very much for having me.
Um, this is a very special dialogue and episode because it's the 50th episode of BRI Dialogue. So Anush and I have been at this on this journey for the past 3 years, and we couldn't be more proud of the quality of our contributors and our guests, including your good self. And today it's the 50th. Before getting into the conversation of today, I would like to briefly introduce you to our audience. Pascal is an associate professor at Kyoto University, where you investigate neutrality in international relations and directs the research network at Neutrality Studies. He received his master's and PhD from National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, and nobody has a better grip on neutrality in the world than Pascal, I have to say that. And previously researched and taught at Waseda University and Temple University. He has articles, books, and his own wonderful program, which we will put in neutrality studies in the link in our discussions. Pascal, I think it's fascinating to have you today with us. And my kickoff question for you is that in an era of tantrums, tariffs, and threats for takeover of sovereign territory, and in 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 an ever growing confrontationality, can neutrality work? So why don't we start there?
This might now sound counterintuitive, but in this environment, neutrality works even better. Or let me put it this way, in this environment, neutrality will pop up even more. The misunderstanding is that in order to be a successful neutral, you have to stay out of everything, touch nothing, and just be a ball with which others then play around. But that's not what neutrality is or how it works in international relations. Neutrality is a very simple, straightforward, bottom-up approach to handle international relations for big and small states. I mean, right now we only think of small states like Switzerland, Austria, or, Finland and Sweden before they gave it up. But traditionally, neutrality has been a policy that also large, powerful states used to use a lot. The most important neutral of the 19th century was without doubt the United States of America. They used neutrality towards Europe only, and in order to stay out of European stupid warfare, from which they had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and they defended their right to trade with everybody while the Europeans were at each other's throats. At the same time, the US still fought its own wars. The US had its Monroe Doctrine and was implementing that in Latin America. It even sucked up another neutral state back in 1898, the neutral kingdom of Hawaii, and gobbled it up and annexed it and included it into its state territory. So neutrality policies do not mean that states are harmless or that states are inherently peaceful. It is a way of dealing with international relations, and within a confrontative international system or a multipolar international system, that policy necessarily thrives more than in a unipolar or even bipolar system. And you might say, oh, but neutrality is on the retreat right now in Europe. And yes, that's true. But neutrality is also on the march outside of Europe. If you look at the way that large parts of Asia and South America and Africa reacted to the war the Russo-Ukrainian war and the NATO-Russia war, proxy war, however you want to call it, that we've got a lot of states who are simply not playing along, or who still keep playing with both sides, who still keep interacting with everybody. And although they don't call themselves neutral, they do act and behave the way that in the 19th century neutral states would have. And this is something that I call neutral in the analytical sense. So what we see more and more is this behavior of neutrality around the world, really like just having a very important time. Also, the entire um, the entire BRICS movement. Many of these states just don't want to pick sides. BRICS itself is not picking a side. BRICS is trying to create alternative routes for states to interact with each other, and this is very important for the policy of neutrality, the practical one. And well, we can discuss more about these differences, but overall, no, the current environment is going to be one of more neutrality, not of less.
That's a fantastic opening, Pascal. Thank you. I'm very interested that you draw clear distinction between passivity and neutrality. That being neutral doesn't mean that you're passive, and in that sense, of course, it becomes into play. But your answer also raises a series of other questions. For example, would you compare the BRICS to the non-ally movement in any shape or form? Um, is the world going in a direction that non-ally movement will become relevant again? But I think it may be harder in today's world, particularly with the Trump presidency, to identify that neutrality because he's now imperialism on steroids. So looking at the major powers, not the global south, say China, say India, for example, would you categorize these countries as neutral or as defensive? How would you go about uh, explain their positioning, given that Modi's just come back from Washington as well in this new emerging so-called world order?
So, for the question of neutrality, the single most important thing to look at is the conflicts that these neutralities are geared towards. Um, Only few states call themselves permanently neutral or have policies of permanent neutrality. Switzerland, Austria, Ireland, Malta, Moldova, and so on are examples. But the largest part of the world that actually is currently very relevant for international relations and is neutral in my analytical sense that I use it, they do not they do not categorize themselves as neutral all the time, but depending on the conflict that pops up, they will decide whether or not to take sides or to, as the Indians usually say, just be on their own side and continue working with everybody. So the the interesting thing is that China, for instance, the Western countries have been saying, "Oh, China, you're supporting Russia, you're helping them, and Russia is only winning the war in Ukraine because you're helping them." But that's not what the Chinese did. The Chinese just didn't put sanctions on Russia. The Chinese continued trading with the Russians, but they didn't send weapons to Russia. They didn't send soldiers to Russia. They kept a working relationship with Ukraine. They had economic interactions with Ukraine. They just remained in an outside position towards both or all of these actors. And that's what most of the world did. And that's also what most of the world does with most of the conflicts. You look at the conflict and then you take a position and you decide on whether or not to only interact one, only the other, or continue interacting with both. And when it comes to Donald Trump, the interesting thing is that he's rekindling U.S. foreign policy, and he's he's on the one hand starting to bully places, especially like Panama and well Denmark when it comes to Greenland, right? But on the other hand, he's on his foreign policy team clearly stated, this unipolar moment is over. We are not trying to do politics of unipolarity anymore. We are accepting that there's Russia and China and they are great powers and this is normal, and we agree in some parts and disagree in others, and we want to have an understanding with them in order to avoid war. But the US will push aggressively for its own interests, and the place that feels that the most at the moment is Europe, because Europe is extremely weak, and the bullies bully the weak, and the Europeans make themselves pretty weak. Um, so the US is now saying like A, pay more for your own defense, B, pay us money for what we've been doing so far, especially when it comes to Ukraine, and C, we want Greenland. Give us Greenland. And now the irony of the situation is that while NATO has been and the Europeans in NATO have been screaming for the longest times at the top of their lung that the greatest threat to their national security and to their territorial integrity is Russia, and Russia wants to take away land from us, Now looks as if it's going to be the United States that's going to take away land from you. Well, that's a twist of things that a lot of many people in Europe didn't see coming, but that is now a reality because, as we are learning, this whole idea that geopolitics is over and we are now a big family that works according to the rules-based international order, and I have my own problems with that term, but maybe we talk about it later. Um, well. Turns out that was never true. States still act based on their own self-interest, and the fact that the Europeans have subordinated their own self-interest under the interests of the United States is now coming back to bite them a lot. Um, Sorry, I kind of went away from the topic of neutrality, but the point that I want to make is that no, the this dynamics, the dynamic that we are used to, and the dynamic under which a lot of international relation theory has been built and has been also explained, is still there, and in within this also the dynamics of third party states will continue. The BRICS is different from the non-aligned movement, but in the core of what it represents, I think they're very similar. But I would rather say that the non-aligned movement is similar to the BRICS, not the BRICS to the non-aligned movement, because BRICS is now moving to a place where NUM never went, which is institutionalization.
Yeah.
And I know that from the minister, foreign minister of Malta, who told me that the person who stood in the way most ardently behind institutionalizing the non-aligned movement, behind creating a central secretariat and creating structures, was Yugoslavia's Tito, because
Mm.
Tito was afraid of the Soviets and said, if we institutionalize this, they will send their people and they will take it over. So Tito stood in the way, apparently, according
Right.
um, to the Maltese, of institutionalization. Now, the BRICS are institutionalizing, and they are institutionalizing quite fast, and they are building structures. So they are definitely going over and beyond what the NUM ever tried to do.
So in terms of looking, so you've mentioned Europe rightly several times, and there is this summit take place in Paris today for Europeans trying to understand what happened while they were asleep, as you put it. But so you say a country like China and India are pursuing their national interests rightly, but putting India aside for a minute, they seem to have found a modus operandi with Trump world. For China, though, I would argue it's a much more complex picture. And for a country that is supposed to be defending the global south, you would think, how many Trump assaults can China take on its interest in the global south, Panama Canal being one of them, for example, before it changes gears and becomes not not an adversary, but much more of a defender of, and then let's call it the norms that China has been playing with so far. And in that context, then, would they see an opportunity to try and build closer links with the European Union, as indeed they've tried to do over the last year or so, when Chancellor Schultz went to Beijing ahead of a large delegation? Do you see these patterns now beginning to change and new ones emerge?
I think they will. I mean, the building of new links, because that has been an essential part of the Chinese foreign policy strategy now for at least 20 years, right? Of trying to embed itself in the global economy and also build the Belt and Road initiative, right? And create these connections and these linkages, especially with Europe. Through different routes and also through by way of sea. So I don't see why the Chinese would end that or stop that. But I must also say I'm not an expert on, I don't know enough about China and about Chinese strategical thinking in order to predict how are going to react to this new politics that Trump is now pursuing. But one thing that is clear is that what always has been most dear to the Chinese is its immediate neighborhood, especially the question of Taiwan. So I think I would naturally expect that the most important questions the Chinese ask is like, how will the US approach the Taiwan issue? Because that is a make it or break it issue for them. And then connected to that is, how is the US Pacific strategy or military strategy? What is it going to look like? So the fact that Donald Trump a couple of days ago announced that he now wants to have a trilateral meeting with China and Russia and talk about arms reduction, about halving. He spoke about halving all each other's military expenditures in order to spend the money on other things. I mean, that to me is a very hopeful sign, and I don't know how the Chinese will interpret it, but I think that is a sign to try to use diplomacy to reach what otherwise you have to use a lot of military power for. And I think that's something that the Chinese can potentially work with, even though it seems also the case that when it comes to Panama and Greenland and so on, Donald Trump apparently and his cabinet have these ideas of spheres of influence or spheres of interest, whatever you want to call them, and they seem to be carving out their space in the Americas for themselves, telling everybody else we run the show over here. But this, to me, is something that the Chinese and the Russians too, to a large extent, probably can work with. Not agree, but work with. Because this is a vision that even if you don't share it, if you can talk about it and if you can come to understandings of how to manage each other's expectations and set these rules of engagement, well, this is something that might actually preserve the peace. It's rather the smaller states that will have to figure out how to deal with bullying officially happening. But also here, um, it's not clear to me yet that the Trump administration, beyond bellicose rhetoric, is actually willing to break the norms, especially when it comes to military affairs. He's been talking about all of that and he's been putting pressure. But so far, what we have seen is using this pressure as a tool of negotiation, not as something that he actualizes. There are a couple of instances in the first Trump administration when he actually didn't use rhetoric, he just used force. And the most horrible example of this one is the assassination of Iranian General Soleimani. But he blew up Soleimani out of the blue. He didn't announce it. So as long as he announces things, I do believe that at least for now, he's still in the realm of like bullying tactic negotiations. But so far, they're going somewhere, and I do think the Chinese will work with that.
Pascal, you were talking about a new, I would say, not like you're professing it, but you are saying we mind our own neighborhood, Monroe Doctrine, Latin America, American continental piece of land, and hey, you guys are entitled to your own realm and spheres of influence, Russia and China. In this light, and with Europe finding itself in the eye of the storm, in this past 3 or 4 days, there are people who are saying the NATO's credibility, sustainability, and presence may come into questioning. Maybe it would be NATO 2.0. And in this context, a NATO representative office in Tokyo, in Japan, will the Japanese find themselves in these current circumstances when they are not allowed as a trusted partner to buy US steel? They just have to put a flag in the backyard of China for a NATO office. Will the Asian powers start reconsidering as well? So is there an accounting and an audit on neutrality and strategic posturing happening in Asia as well? Or this is only in Europe that the chaos is brewing and everybody's running from one capital to the other? How do you
Well,
evaluate the environment in Asia Pacific?
Well, it's a good point. It's a good question. I would say the chaos at the moment is definitely, or the feeling of everything being in chaos is definitely the strongest in Europe. And just to make it clear, like what I said before is what I think we're mo moving toward, like this carving out of spheres of influence and interest. I don't think that's inherently good. I don't think it's inherently bad. I just think that's where we are moving. So I think that that's at least the vision of where the Trump administration is taking it. Whether Russia and China want to work with that is another question. But and whether it's a good one is a third one. But it's analysis is not about what's good. Analysis is about what's happening. And in Asia, I mean, the Japanese are highly insecure. So they are, but I would say the shock right now, at least from what I seem to feel here is it's less of a shock than what it was during the first Trump administration, because during the first administration, that's when the Japanese understood that they cannot count on the Americans to always be there for them. And they took certain measures, including increasing defense spending, including like changing their defense strategies. And this has good and bad sides. A good side is that they are potentially preparing for the for a complete U.S. withdrawal. On the other side, they now do look more. They do remilitarize, and they do look now more dangerous to the Chinese and the Koreans. So the Asia will have to work, or will have to work um, on how to approach the security dilemma. And Japan has on the one hand, Japan is a trusted partner in Asia for quite many other Asian states, especially Southeast Asia. On the other hand, especially China and Korea still perceive Japan under the lens of the Second World War, and that is something many Japanese don't understand, which is a serious problem because it increases the risk of miscommunication. Then again, the Japanese have also been fostering defense to ministry links with the defense ministry, so that they have a hotline they can call the Chinese to Beijing in order to de-escalate if something should happen in the East or South China Sea, right? To like emergency phone calls. The Japanese are also quite afraid. They are afraid of China, and even more so of North Korea. They have serious fears that North Korea might use these missiles that they built in order to attack Japan. That's one of their deepest fears, even though the North Koreans haven't done so. The North Koreans act rather predictably in a certain way, but all of this is difficult to interpret. Now, the rest of Asia, I mean, what I hear, especially also from or see from Southeast Asia, is that people are rather optimistic about their own position in this new field. That has less to do with Donald Trump and the United States, and more just with the general dynamic of Southeast Asia as really not only emerging markets, but emerging technology hubs and emerging population centers, industries, and there is geopolitical risk, but the biggest geopolitical risk is a war between China and the United States, and them being caught in between. And actually, Southeast Asians are reacting exactly the way that I would think they do, which is they start using more politics of neutrality. They don't only participate in the BRICS, but literally the Minister of the Economy of Malaysia in December last year, right before Malaysia took over the helmet of the ASEAN group, right, as this year's presidency. They took that over in January, and right before that, the Minister of the Economy, he wrote an article in the South China Morning Post, I believe it was, where he said that the greatest asset of ASEAN is its neutrality. ASEAN as a whole, he proclaimed, is neutral and will work with everybody and will be a bridge in the Pacific, across regions and civilizations. And so, in general, there is problems, of course, but I think the mood is much more optimistic, and definitely when compared to to Europe, which now is just in utter panic because they don't know anymore how to react to what's hitting them from the across the pond.
So, but don't you think there is a massive contradiction in the way the US is changing its profile? On the one hand, you allude to this idea that there might be demilitarization in the pipeline between China and the United States, for example, and yet, on the other hand, exactly following the behavior of the United States under Trump, encourages militarization in Europe, in Japan, in South Korea, probably. And the way that, Britain is, for example, is now increasing its military expenditure. I think probably all of NATO Europe will do the same. Is you could argue on the one hand is exactly what Americans want, more investment by other NATO members. But the flip side of that, of course, is that it's increasing militarization
Yeah.
of the world's greatest economies. And that really isn't in anybody's interest, particularly not even the United States's. If this vision that somehow Trump wants to de-escalate tensions, he seems to be going absolutely the wrong way around it about it.
Well, I mean, it depends. I view Donald Trump as somebody and his administration who mainly, first and foremost, wants to keep the United States out of these international conflicts. And I I'm not sure his vision is to globally demilitarize and bring in global peace. It's really just extricate the United States out of as many of these conflicts as possible and only use military force where absolutely necessary. So in this sense, I don't think the big picture of the globe is what they are aiming for. So the remilitarization of the remilitarization of Japan has been going on since before Mr. Trump, right? This has been like quite a while, but and of Europe, that is a consequence of many intertwining factors, but the US now slowly taking itself out is certainly going to accelerate that. But on the one hand, that might still be very good business for the United States military-industrial complex, right? And forcing US weapons on Europe, that is a benefit to the US. And to me, Donald Trump thinks in simple like cost benefit terms. What does it cost us? What does it pay for us? And how does it work for us? So I don't think we should mistake Mr. Trump for somebody who wants to bring global peace. I think he just wants the maximum benefit for America, which is understandable. Might not be good, but understandable. So in this sense, I think it's a logical consequence. And maybe overall it's a net negative for the world, who knows? But at least for now, it seems that the idea that the US calls the shots also in all of these foreign theaters and wants to proactively insert itself the way it inserted itself for 80 years into the Middle East is, I think that one is changing, and that's now going to have a downstream effect.
Pascal, about a month ago, just before Christmas, something major happened, and everybody looked over it because the houses in California were on fire, and all kinds of other events, and the runner-up to the election, etc. And that was that China and India had a moment that they said, "Let us not lock horns in, Himalayas. Let us have a decompression. Let us talk and revisit." And I am finding as humanity, we are very complacent, all of us, because these are two nuclear powers with a grudge for decades long. And we don't stop for a minute in a symbolic way across the capitals. I would love to see European parliamentarians getting up and clapping for China and India. Seriously, even in a symbolic way that, hey, bravo to you for withdrawing rather than locking horns and bringing humanity at the brink of annihilation. Where do you think this cross-contamination of research, universities, policy, and media have happened to mask over some important things, but have, more agrandissement on, I don't know, Super Bowl and what Taylor Swift is wearing? Why we can't stop and look at some of these big issues in the context of neutrality and give credit and give a humanitarian shout loud out to capitals like Beijing and Delhi that bravo for decompressing. And how do we go about that as an academia and as a researcher?
You're absolutely right. I mean, these great achievements, these non-Euro-Atlantic achievements, is something that the Euro-Atlantic community constantly either misses or actively ignores. And the way that China and India have been dealing with their border disputes is admirable. And not just since December, they have been doing that since before. The way that China and Russia have de escalated their border disputes, which almost brought them to the brink of war during the Cold War, that is admirable. The way that, even like, how tiny nations like Bhutan have been able to interact with their neighborhood is admirable. And we constantly just not only forget, but we actively ignore that in Europe and the US. And that's really that skews our image of international relations really, really badly, in a very unhealthy way for ourselves. I mean, just keep in mind this whole stupid, dumb narrative of, oh, Russia wants to invade Europe. Russia is going to take over Ukraine, and if we don't stop them in Ukraine, they will take over everything. There was such a dumb moment, and especially when you think about the fact that it has been sold to us as Russia is an autocratic system that hates democracies. They hate democracy. They hate freedom. Therefore, they want to take over the entire continent. It's like, Jesus Christ. And they were trying to make the same argument with China, right? China is an authoritarian state. Therefore, it's trying to invade Taiwan. This is so dumb. If you just for one instance looked at how China and Russia treat Mongolia, Mongolia is sandwiched in between them. It is an open field. If both of them decided, they would devour Mongolia tomorrow, but they don't. And Mongolia is a working, functioning, an ever better functioning democracy, and the democratic process has been improved over the last 25 years, every single year. It's beautifully democratizing. And Russia and China don't care because the system, the way that the system runs doesn't interest them as long as the state actually is not adversarial to them. And Mongolia is fulfilling a wonderful buffer function between Russia and China, and they understand that. And I even talked to a Mongolian ambassador just recently in October and said, like, oh, are you offended if somebody calls you a buffer state? Is that a bad term to use? And he looked at me and said, like, no, that's what we are. We're fine with that, and we're doing that, playing that role. And as long as Mongolia makes sure that both of its large neighbors are more or less happy, Mongolia will be fine. Because what would be the interest of either of the two big ones to pick a fight over Mongolia, right? So this entire and like leaving that out because Mongolia was never on the radar of the Europeans. Neither is like so many of the achievements of China and India, for instance. And leaving all that out, of course, is what's very important to keep that narrative alive that has been so damaging to Europe, that there's no way that democracies can live with autocracies, and it's either them or us, right? Therefore, we have to make sure the dictatorships go down, while not realizing that the damage that they're doing at home drives them in the other direction. But yeah. Um, so yes, this myopia of
Mm.
Europe first and foremost, even less than the Americans, because the Americans understand have a bit of a more of a broader outlook. They do, but the Europeans are very, to me, surprisingly myopic when it comes to that. The fact that they cannot, at least in, let's say, mainstream media and in certain quarters of also the academic and diplomacy discourse, that you cannot perceive these other success stories and then adjust your worldview. That really flabbergasts me, and is one of the reasons why I run my own YouTube channel, in order to just talk against that, because there is people who understand it. There is. It's just the majority, the discourse doesn't move in that direction.
So, you know, you suggest that, Europe has got into a habit of securitizing its
Yes.
its
Yes.
interactions by
Yes.
what it regards potential enemies or adversaries,
Yes.
um, and that the autocratic regimes tend to avoid that where they can. Given, so maybe I'm putting words
Not
in your
not
mouth.
necessarily, but
Not
that's what we
right.
have seen recently. Yes.
Uh, um, and that somehow, where there are non-Western involvements, like between China and India, these countries can get on with it and find their own opportunities to de-escalate, as they've done, as Ali suggested, on the border between China and India. Just yesterday, the Americans seem to be suggesting that Taiwan is entitled to an independent sovereign right, which I saw as rag to the bull, sitting in Beijing. Now, that may be again a paper provocation rather than an actual policy change. But in a sense, autocracies also have global interests that they pursue, somewhere sometimes more aggressively than other places. So, South China is a good example of this. But where are these lines, do you think, Pascal, in the sea or in the sand? For example, where AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US, this military submarine deal to to dissipate because of Trump, tensions between US and Britain, where do the Chinese in particular apply pressure, or not in the other direction? How are they going to decide where are these neutral or securitized zones? Because the assumption is Europe doesn't have the subtlety to make the difference, and that China does. But where are these boundaries, do you think?
I'm not entirely sure if I understand the question correctly, but I do think that the some of the projects that are running, right? AUKUS and what are they called, the Five Eyes and so on, these projects to create of alliance formation on one or the other level, that is of course something China perceives, and of course they know, and also the entire development of technologies, submarine warfare, the development of that, of what these countries can or cannot run, the way that the bases are distributed all over Japan, down to the Philippines and so on. All of this is something that, of course, is on the mind of China, and all of this is something that the Chinese will watch on what the Trump administration is going to do with it. It's also the question of what the Trump administration can do. I mean, the question is still: is Trump going to be able to dismantle what he calls the deep state, or what he calls the permanent state? And all large states, all modern nation states have large bureaucratic apparatus, and all of them have multi-year, contracts and running engagements and programs and so on. So, I mean, countries are like very, very, very large ships, and all the captain can do is like slightly maneuver it to the left or to the right. It cannot go into reverse gear completely. So what Donald Trump is doing right now, also with like in the intelligence community and with the USAID, these are attempts at influencing the bureaucratic state, which has all of these programs, and it's yet we have to see how far he will get with that, with changing course. But with what what we have to look out for is whether or not he manages to, or whether or not he will not manages, but whether or not what the outcome of these actions, and also of the policy actions of the Chinese and the Russians and the Japanese, whether it will be one of bringing us away from this escalatory spiral, which at the moment is still turning. I do think when it comes to Russia, the Trump and Putin already managed to kind of at least stop the worst, right? It's not you're not escalating anymore. Whether this goes into reverse and becomes like a virtuous spiral, which then starts solving, for instance, the Ukraine conflict, that remains to be seen. The Chinese will certainly try to figure out how to deal with the United States, but one of the issues that even the Trump administration can't overcome for sure is the fact that the United States runs on a 4-year cycle. They don't know who's going to come after Trump. I mean, and they would be dumb. I mean, no, no, never ever would they put all their eggs into the Trump basket and say like, oh, as long as we are good with them, everything is fine. The problem is the United States is not the Trump administration. It's not a certain politician or a certain group. It is the outcome of an oscillating back and forth of several parties and streams within US society. And this is something the Chinese will try to manage over the long term. I don't know what their strategies are, but certainly that's on their mind, because the US is extremely volatile. I think China and Russia over the last 20 years have been way more stable in term and predictable in terms of their foreign policy than the United States has been. And that's certainly as one of the worries that exist in Beijing and probably also in Moscow.
Pascal, one or two questions, and then we have to bring it home because we would love to carry on, but mindful of your time and the time difference as well. Is there a recognition in Washington that the future conflicts are not necessarily nuclear anymore? That's why this call to reducing the stockpiles, because everything is moving to deep seek and AI and critical infrastructure. Is that where US shifting its, yes, we will have the deterrent policy, but let us really cut the noise around that, give the world a respite while we're digging into how to cut each other's critical infrastructure, which is as dangerous as any other thing, huh? Or the satellites or the space wars. That's my closing question. And last but not least, we ask all of our guests if they were to leave the audience on this particularly 50th episode with one piece of advice to the cinephobes and cinephiles, what would Pascal Lottaz, sitting in Tokyo, give as a piece of advice to our cinephobes or cinephile viewers And my question in and around demilitarization and reducing the stockpiles of nuclear armament.
Maybe the first question first. I do think that one of the things that the Ukraine war showed is that classical like trench warfare is still possible in the 21st century, and it just happened, and it is as bloody and as horrible as we remember from the First World War. The fact that we have nukes didn't change that. The other technologies that we might have not have foreseen have a larger like battlefield impact, like drones. So I do think that there's a general rethinking of the fightability of wars. But I also think that there's a rethinking of the danger of nuclear escalation, and I do hope that this nuclear escalation thing that we will get to the point where we have a common consensus and agreement, and we will never shake on that again. That nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That we have a universal agreement about that. I don't think we can get rid of the nuclear weapons, but if we have a universal agreement and we keep to protocols that we yet have to create, hopefully on the UN level, then maybe we can put that genie into like a little bit back into its bottle. But then that will only let out the genie of like, trench warfare and maritime warfare. And I think we might see the return of that. Because the management of this then is the question on whether or not you are good at diplomacy, because this type of warfare like land trench warfare or sea warfare is, as Clausewitz said, then the extension of politics by other means, right? And so the question is, can we do politics on a lower level? We will never get rid of the conflicts, right? And we don't have to. Conflicts are normal, conflicts are okay. The question is, do we fight them with weapons, or do we boil them on a lower level? So I would hope that we develop the mechanisms and that we get back to diplomacy, which is a way of fighting these conflicts on a lower level and find, if not resolutions, then at least working arrangements. Now, the second question on xenophobia, my general advice is don't be xenophobic. That makes no sense. We have so many beautiful people in so many beautiful places. You don't need to hate any kind of foreigners. Um, it makes very good sense if we try to not bomb each other's homes to ashes, because that's when people start moving involuntarily.
Mm.
I have nothing against voluntary movement of people, and I'm a great fan because I'm a Swiss white dude living in Japan. I'm an immigrant over here, and I am very happy to report that I live here happily, and the Japanese welcomed me. But if all of Japan, if all of Switzerland moved to Japan because Switzerland got bombed to ashes, the attitude of the Japanese would immediately change. So my advice is be kind and nice to each other and accept each other's humanity, and please try not to bomb other places' homes to ashes. That's the best guardian against involuntary movement of people.
And that's the best note on which to end as well, Pascal. You've left us with some fascinating insights. I think for me, to look at Trump in a very different context is a major takeaway. That try and separate rhetoric from some of the actions that may follow, and then you will understand perhaps a bit more clearly what he's up to. It may not be any less dangerous, but it not be as horrific as you might expect. Secondly, that actually Europe needs to begin to desecuritize its worldview and try and understand dynamics of change at the global level in a very different, perhaps a a a de-Atlanticized lens. And I know that the Chinese have been trying that for a very long time to try and get Europe to become more Eurasian than Euro-Atlantic. That may well be happening. I don't know. Go on.
May I add one thing? Most
Yes.
Europeans are not aware that you can get on Google Maps turn-by-turn direction of how to walk or drive from Portugal to Singapore to Vladivostok to Beijing. It's one single continent, my friends.
Yes.
We can walk there, so it would make sense if we keep that in mind. We belong together. That also goes, by the way, for the Middle East and so on. We belong together.
And I think that could be one gift that Trump would be giving Eurasia to finally rediscover this one massive, hugely potentially rich supercontinent. So that's another takeaway that we take from you, Pascal, on our 50th recording, and the fact that, like other valued guests, you underline the importance of humanity in everything that we must do. And Ali and I really appreciate you emphasizing that point, which is actually Ali and I's own departure point at every juncture. So thank you very much, Pascal, for being our guest today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you both.